This is a really good question. This probably, if I fit 10 or 15 people in a week, probably around 4 or 5 of them are in this exact situation. So they've gotten into riding, they're 1 or 2 years in, they have an older bike that they dip their toe in the water with this bike and they're not sure if it's right. So they come to me to get recommendations for the next frame, and they ask all the right questions a lot of the time, but sometimes stuff that they didn't really consider. And this video will try and address some of the critical things. So what should you look for in your next bike? Now, the first thing, the overarching kind of ethos of the answer is that your next bike should be fit for purpose. You should question yourself and say, what am I going to do with this thing? Do I want a bike which I can chuck a different set of wheels on and go riding on gravel on the weekend? Do I want a bike which I can race at the local criteriums on the weekend? Do I want a commuting bike which I can also ride on the weekend for longer bunch rides? Do I just want to ride out in the hills with my mates at slow pace for hours on end? We want to choose something which is fit for purpose.
I want a bike that looks good at the Cafe Neil, an aero bike with integrated bars.
Get out. I want to see you again. Yeah, so I want something which doesn't suit me at all but looks really cool, is what you're saying. So this is the trap that people fall into, is they go to the local bike shop, or they look around online and they go, far out, that looks 795 blade looks awesome. What are you going to do with it? 40k rides twice a week? No, no, don't do it. So you want something that is fit for purpose. Now, endurance bikes, crossover gravel bikes, road bikes, they all have their fortes and their drawbacks, right? So they have good and bad things about them. Things like compliance in the back end, rigidity, tyre size, tyre clearance, the adjustability of the cockpit. So looking at things like an integrated cockpit and stuff like that versus a standard stem. These are things which you really want to consider. If you're riding around doing a lot of endurance stuff on coarse chip seal in the backcountry, look for something with a fairly big tyre, a 30 or a 32, and drop the pressures down so it's more compliant. That sort of thing. You don't want to potentially go for something that's too harsh and too stiff and too rigid, or too long and low in the front end. So look for a race bike versus an endurance bike versus a crossover sort of bike, if we're talking about road bikes. Look for those things and don't be sucked into, oh my gosh, that one looks awesome, I'll have that, before you consider these other things. So endurance bikes tend to have more compliance. They sometimes have things like slacker head angles for more stable steering, that sort of stuff, slightly longer wheelbases, so they feel very smooth and stable at high speed, that sort of stuff, at the expense of a tiny bit of agility. Look for something that is fit for purpose. So an endurance bike for most people is often a good way to go. If you're racing and you really want to go fast, or you're super flexible and you need a really long load bike, look into the race bikes, you know, your Tarmacs and your Scott Foils and that sort of stuff. The Chapter 2, the Coco that's behind me, for example. If you're doing that sort of riding, look for a race bike. But if you're not, try and stay away from them. You'll often end up with something which is just a bit harsher than you want, a little bit like it's nimble, but it's almost too sharp in the steering because it's designed for riding at really high speed and agility, and it'll be unnecessarily stiff. So look for something that's fit for purpose. Number 2, geometry. And this is where the people that are coming to me, this is what they really want to know, is what sort of geometry should I look for in the new bike? The best way to do this is to obviously go and see someone like me, if you've got the funds and the ability, get some recommendations on the next bike's geometry so that you can then go shopping with confidence and looking at the reach, the stack, the seat tube angle, the layback on the clamp, on the seat post, that sort of stuff. If you've got someone like me around, it's money well spent. If not, and you're fairly comfortable in your old position, reference off that position. Look up the geometry of the frame and then look at the reach, the stack, and if you can delve into other YouTube videos explaining what these numbers all mean, and I would highly recommend that you do so. Look into these things, the seat tube angle, the layback on the seat post, and look at where it's all set up, and then reference back to the video that we did about looking at like geometry considerations for your next frame, and we'll put a link to that up here. How to replicate your position across onto the new bike as well. This sort of stuff will enable you to not buy the wrong bike, geometrically speaking. So
there's some good websites for this as well, like Geometry Geeks. You can compare like 10 bikes against one specific geometry and see how it aligns.
Yep. So if you're, for example, you've got a 54 centimeter tarmac at the moment and you've had to put an enormous spacer stack under the front of it, like a 40 mil spacer to get the bars high enough, and it's got quite a long reach out at like 390 millimeters or something, and you have to run a 70 millimeter stem on it, you're going to want to look for something that is both taller in the front end, so with a higher stack dimension, but also a shorter reach so that you can run a longer stem. So reference off the geometry of your old bike and try and extrapolate to what you want. And ideally, for really small frames, a 90mm stem or longer is no problem. For larger frames, a 100 or longer is good, right? So if you can change the reach dimension of the frame that you're looking at based upon the stem length that you want. So try not to go much shorter than a 90 or an 80 if you really have to. 80s are no problem on a smallish bike, but on a big bike, an 80 does make the steering a little bit too sharp for a lot of people.
Looks weird as well. Aesthetically, it's not good now.
That's very true. That is very true. And we're all about aesthetics.
Oh, 100%.
So your reach and your stack are probably the two most critical things to get right. And then have a look at where the seat post is clamped. And if your seat post is, if your seat is shoved all the way forward, for example, on the post, you might want to look for a bike with a slightly steeper seat tube angle to allow you to clamp that seat more in the center of the rails. Or you might look for a bike which has the ability to purchase a zero offset seat post so that you're not maxed out on your saddle travel. Yeah. So look at the geometry of the bikes. That's your second consideration, and try and delve into this a bit. And if it's still just too much, go and see someone like me if possible, because they will hopefully steer you down the right path of the next frame. So the bike should be fit for purpose. It should have the right geometry. Crank length. This is one that a lot of people never really think about. If you're buying a bike from a local bike shop, a lot of the time you can say to the guys or the girls at the bike shop, hey, can you swap out the 172s for, say, 165s, for example? Read into crank length. Have a look at our videos about crank length. If you think you need to deviate from what the bike comes from the factory, tell the guys or girls at the shop. And they can often say, oh, yeah, we'll just build it with whatever crank length you want for no extra cost. A lot of the direct-to-consumer brands, you can't do this. You can't say to Canyon, for example, hey, can you put 165s on it? You sort of get what you get, right? But if you're buying it from a local shop, often they can change the crank length for you. And if you've got really short legs or hip impingement issues or something which you've identified from looking at our crank length videos, consider the crank length and consider asking the shop to actually change them for you before you buy it. Number 4, don't buy an integrated cockpit bike unless you know exactly what you want. So the one behind me, the beautiful Chapter 2, it's got an integrated 110 by 400mm bar, and we knew exactly what we wanted, and we were able to tell that to the guys who were supplying it, so we know we're not going to have a problem because we've looked at the reach and we know that it's going to all work out. But for the average person, adjustability is king, right? So having the ability to get the bike and it's totally different to my old bike, and the reach just feels a bit long, so I'm just going to change the stem, which might be a $150 job, no problem. To change the stem on that, or any of the integrated cockpit bikes, your BMCs, your Treks, anything, you're looking at sometimes up nearly $1,000 to change the cockpit length or the width, even just the width of the bar. You know, if you've got a bar that's way too wide or too narrow and you want to change it, it can be $1,000 job, you know, by the time you buy the new materials and get them all fitted up with the internal cable routing. So my advice is, unless you know exactly what you need and you're all over the geometry of this sort of stuff, get a bike with a non-integrated cockpit so that you can change the stem length after the fact if you feel like it's too long or too short. Really, really highly advisable. And the last one, look at the bar width. And this is one that most people never really think about. The bike comes with a 42 and that's what you get. Again, the bike shop might be able to, if it's a good local bike shop, and I always advise people, if possible, to purchase from their local bike shop if they can. If it's a good shop, they might say to you, oh yeah, we order the bike from the manufacturer, we'll spec whichever group set you want, and we'll put whichever bar width on it that you want. So look into the bar width, and if you want a 38 and it comes with a 42, ask the guys at the shop if they can build it with that. If you don't ask, you'll never know. Most of the local bike shops are quite happy to source that stuff, and sometimes there's a small changeover cost. They have to absorb the cost of like moving the components over to another bike or something, but a lot of the time they'll just do it for you. Yeah, so try and go for the bar width that you want, the crank length that you want, and then have the ability to change the stem, because a bike that doesn't fit you once you've purchased it is a terrible thing. You know, you spend all this money and think, oh, this thing just doesn't feel right because the cranks are too long and da-da-da-da-da. Yeah, and it is highly advisable to try and figure this stuff out before you purchase it. And then all the other stuff beyond this is stuff that you don't need to worry about most of the time. What color is the bike? How aerodynamic is it? Da, 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 da. These are things which we viscerally buy bikes based upon how they look a lot of the time, but you should consider this other stuff more than the appearance of the bike, in my opinion. So we're all slaves to fashion at some level, mate. But
of course.
Try not to let that be your only purchasing metric.
Yes.
The number of times I've had someone come in on a fantastic top spec Pinarello Dogma or something, and it's got a 50 millimeter spacer stack under the stem, and the stem is 70 mil long instead of 110, and it handles too sharp, and it's just completely the wrong bike for them. But they love the way it looked. Try not to get roped into that impulse purchasing sort of stuff too much.
Yes.
Yeah. Use your forebrain. Plan ahead.
Yeah.
Plan ahead.
Well said.
It shouldn't just be about the looks of the bike.